Hi, host Eric here. Let's talk with three people. Let's talk briefly about this institutions and the power of institutions thing and this generational notion and stuff like that. So first of all, I said in the previous video that the institutions thicken over time. That that aspect of this theory that he had of institutions alternatingly becoming more present and less present in individuals' lives in inverse proportionality to another element, which is basically revolutionariness or something. That aspect of the theory is inaccurate, it was my claim, because even if it describes certain instances of change over society, the overall political institutions, anyway, only thicken over time. And that's going to require eventually I guess maybe that's the revolution. That's probably the next revolution after the genetic stuff. I mean, or maybe it's happening concurrently. Is a political it's a political non-revolution. It's the ability of individuals to successfully withdraw from governance.
They're just competing ideologies that are trying to grab the reins of government and their institutions. So it's whatever ideology is being manifested at the time. So each coming age has their own spirit or ideas that classify them as a group. So the baby boomers, they were against the institution that dropout. What was called that? Tune in, get high, drop out, or something. So the institutional power became very weak then, and then financial power grew out of that. So once there is tightening,
that's not what happened.
Huh?
That's not what happened.
They were the financial generation. That's what led up to the high of the 90s. Is that institutional power is deregulated.
Your link from the 60s to the 90s.
It's out of deregulation that happened.
Your link from the 60s to the 90s doesn't.
It's one generation that grew up through that entire period, though, that became that voting bloc.
Okay. Well, your link's weak as fuck, dude.
It's not a link, it's that there are times where things happen and shift.
You're describing a mechanism, and you're giving an example for that mechanism that directly contradicts the mechanism, and so you're reaching for a mechanism because this supposed destabilization of institutions in the 60s didn't lead to financial boom in the 70s. It led to financial recession in the 70s. It didn't lead to
the financial boom. It led to the idea, the ideology that freedom is the persevering or the thriving ideology, that freedom is the hegemon. And that hegemony is what allowed other financial institutions to thrive.
Listen, what you're saying, this theory of yours is not to be preferred at all from the much simpler explanation that where there is oppression and injustice, people react against it. And where
that's a moral belief. That's not an institution, though. There are competing factors between what people think are moral and what institutions will do to counteract that. There are ethical forms of violence that directly opposed to our inherent morality.
Okay, first of all, let's step back and you assert a clear position that you're advocating that you think is
because you're such an absolutist.
Okay. Step back a second. Assert a clear position that you're actually advocating. All right, and
that institutional power thrives in crises, and that financial powers thrive in awakenings.
And do you have any way of delineating between a crisis and an awakening?
Periods of time and wars. So whatever period of the main stressors of society that are being resolved, or they're taking the most focus away from the middle-aged and adult generations.
So, no?
No, that is
That's a distinction between crisis and awakening? I can't tell which is which. Tell me again.
because you're not looking at it. You're not
You,
looking
you
at
didn't you didn't answer the question is why. I asked you to describe the
wars.
difference between
Wars.
a
Like World
crisis.
War II, the end of World War II was the end of the crisis. That
Okay.
was a major issue that
All right.
convulsed
So, how about
all societies into a certain belief or into a certain civic mindset.
okay, all right. So listen. Is was the
You're such a
are,
Gen Xer.
are the rolling brownouts in my
Huh?
neighborhood? Is that are the rolling brownouts in Southern California? We're having some rolling brownouts. Occasionally, the power will go out for an hour or something. It hasn't happened to me, but we're having them. Is that a crisis?
I mean, just because there are crises within the intermediate reactions of a society doesn't mean that's what catalyzes people to be focused around a certain ideal. That doesn't mean it's always paid attention to. Like
Do
the
you
energy
understand the
crisis,
question I'm
that is
asking?
something that's being paid attention to heavily, which is causing a lot of financial investment into these industries.
Okay, so
That socially changes the environment.
okay, so these crises are basically what you think is important, or
No, I
what a
think
lot of people think is important. How many people have think is important to be a crisis?
whatever causes people to raise arms against a cause.
So it has to include. So anytime there's violence, you have a
Whenever
crisis.
there's reactions.
You're not saying anything.
Yeah, I am. It's that whenever some people start taking their personal investments and focusing it on more broader, bigger pictures rather than the individual. So there are
So
periods when individual thrives, and there are periods where social community thrives.
so if you have a bunch of non-thriving individuals, how's the community thriving?
The community thrives through them. That even though they don't have stronger powers for themselves, that the group coalesces around their ideals, and that causes a
Okay, you
focal
get.
point of power.
I,
That
I
is how power is distributed.
are
Is
are
power is
are
distributed
you
to
aware that
people.
you're talking out of your ass, or are you
I know what I'm
genuinely?
talking about, though.
You just said you have periods of time when individuals thrive and are happy,
And then
and,
there are institutions
and then you have
when
time when
they
the individuals aren't thriving and aren't happy, and those times you have thriving communities. That's an
not
interesting one,
thriving
Beau.
communities, just thriving states.
Thriving states. Hmm. So now it's states that we're talking about, not communities. Okay.
Anything. It could be anything
Could
that
be anything.
coalesces people
Could
to a
be
civic
anything,
group.
really. What you're
It
saying
could be
could
anything
really
that
be
coalesces
anything.
people to a
It
civic group. That's the distinction. It's the distinction between
could be
civic
turtles.
order, civic order, and personal order.
Uh huh. So, what the
You're
fuck
such a
kind
Gen
of?
Xer. You're such a Gen Xer.
Okay, if you would say words that meant things, I might react to them differently. I don't know what you're not saying words that mean anything, Beau. I don't know
No,
what else to tell you.
maybe because you're so used to.
Beau, hold on a second. If I ask you a simple question like, can you differentiate between a crisis and an
I
awakening?
just did wars.
So, but when I try to pin you down on it, you don't get there, do you?
I just did Vietnam, Iraq, all of those, North
Are those
Korea,
all
all
the
of those
crises? Can you
wars,
list all the
all
crises?
from
How many different crises and awakenings have there
after
been?
the 60s. There was a growing imperial struggle
How
that
many?
happened within America, and that's what led to our.
How many?
Huh?
How many crises and awakenings have there been?
I mean, the crisis doesn't mean it's going to catalyze the entire generation. That just means there's
Well,
going to be
your central
a
thesis here, Beau. Your central thesis here.
the crises that happen throughout an entire platform,
How
not
many?
just within the generation.
So how do we know if you're in an awakening generation or a crisis one, Beau?
Whether institutions are powerful or not, and whether or not the war efforts are being channeled to create a civic youth. That's the Patriot Act. That's the Patriot Act. That's exactly what it is.
Okay, so
Welcome to my world.
I your world is ordered very strangely.
Yes, it is because we have so much like I forgot what the word pollution.
You're talking about things that don't mean anything. You're talking about generations of
So
awakening and
much
generations of
information.
crisis and yada yada
So much
yada.
information given to us.
Sometimes big shit happens in the world. Sometimes medium shit happens in the world. Sometimes little shit happens in the world. These words you're saying about periods of
But
this and
what
periods of
happens
that.
after that? What happens once those powers recede? Who becomes powerful?
Bo, I'm trying to explain something important to you.
Yeah.
These words you're saying, they don't mean anything.
Yes, they do. Just because you don't know what they mean doesn't mean they don't mean anything.
Bo, the reason they don't mean anything is not because I don't know what they mean. It's because you can't explain them.
I just explained them right now, so you lose. You literally just lost the argument.
Bo, do you know what it means to answer a question?
I just did. I answered the question.
You gave me an answer. You didn't answer the question, though. Do you understand the
I
difference?
did. Yes, I did. I answered it perfectly.
Okay, then, but let's ask it again and see. Let's see
Okay.
if you can do this. So, do you have any way to distinguish between what counts as a crisis and what counts as an awakening? Now, you said war, okay? I pointed out there were multiple crises, some of which might count as a war, some might count as a skirmish, and that there are more crises than there could possibly be generationally defined periods. And I asked you to number how many crises are there. Did you answer that question, Beau?
The major crises that happen are the ones that form the generation, but that doesn't mean that the generation is not going to have a crisis just because they're awakening generation. The awakening generation still have civic standards they have to live up to. It's just that there's a growing new paradigm around either spirituality, around new forms of living, new lifestyles, new technologies that grows.
Uh-huh.
So while we're fortifying the nations, a new generation is forming, and that grows up into a new world that has completely changed its focal point or its vision
Okay,
from the old world, and that
Beau,
causes conflict.
I'm going to explain to you what's happening here. You're drawing lines around stuff.
Because those lines are important.
You, you don't know what I was going to say.
Okay, go.
You're drawing lines around stuff and saying, see, there are lines around these things. That's
Yes,
it. That's all you're doing.
there are lines. Look at the lines then. Look at the graph. Do
No,
you think a graph?
No, but
Do you think a
Beau,
graph
but
chart
Beau,
is just
no, Beau, listen.
it's
What I'm
just
saying is the
useless
bound,
chart?
Beau,
No, it has information on
you're
it.
not talking about actual things, though. You
Read the
see,
graph. Read
You're-
the graph.
you don't provide a graph because you don't have a definition for these things.
There are many graphs about these things.
What things?
About generations. There's the whole industry built around
Beau,
that.
let's work this way. What do we agree on? We agree generations exist. Okay, how many generations have there been since World War II?
4.
Okay, how many crises have there been since World War II?
Like instantaneously, anything can be a crisis.
Okay, so what are you saying then? If anything can be a crisis?
That anything that causes a reaction in the community and has to be addressed, that changes their vision. And it's not about whether or not, because the awakening isn't really about something that is like peaceful or like against the civic order. It's actually something a lot more personal. It's about what they believe and what are
So does
strategies war they are going
does
to
my
be.
does my perspective get to be an awakening?
Your personal awakening, like your personal sexual awakening, that was one thing that was focused on as a society, was whether a sexual awakening.
I'm not that old, dude.
Yeah.
Um, I was a teenager in the late '80s. So
Yeah.
the point is, but the point I'm making though is, you seem to position somebody else's resistance as necessarily like your own and on your team. How do you deal with resistance that opposes yours? Would you consider that an awakening or a crisis?
It depends if it's resolved or not.
Do you have any way of providing a criteria that I can use that make it objective that we can both share to determine whether something's a
Well, if
crisis
it's
or
resolved, then there's a new standard by which we can go by, and those standards can be implemented throughout the rest of society. And this is where we get so many course cases from.
how do we
These court
know? How do we know? How can you and I both look at the same thing, use one tool that reads the same output,
That's
crisis
all
or
law is.
awakening? Or crisis
That's
or
all
awakening?
law is. Law is just about our divisions in morality and how we're going to
Okay, so,
standardize.
but that you're not answering the question I'm
It's
asking,
not
are you?
about awakening. Isn't some higher transcendental thing. We
Then
shouldn't
what
think
is
of
it?
it.
What is it, Beau?
It's social powers becoming dominant.
How do you know when it's that and not a bunch of people getting mad about Trayvon Martin? Or is that the awakening? An awakening? Who's awakening? What about people
That is
awakening?
an awakening. That is a part of an awakening.
Okay, so if I then am part of the group that opposes, uh, that supports Zimmerman, and says, "Go Zimmerman, you did a great thing," is that an awakening?
I mean, there are parts of history that are on the wrong side, of course, but
That's
they
an
eventually.
awakening too, real right? It's its own kind of
Huh?
awakening. That's an awakening too, though, right?
What do you mean? How so?
Well, it's a community reacting against an event. It's just
I
reacting
think
on the other side. It's how you don't like.
it's not an awakening because it's reactionary, but I'm not saying
Well,
that the race
why is it an awakening then when you are against
because it's
Zimmerman?
reactionary. Not against. It's not trying to educate the populace, but trying to react against what someone is already doing.
So, is there any
I don't
position?
deny.
Is
I
there
don't
any?
deny that the racist white community has awakening. I think that they do have awakenings, and that deeply affects their community.
Okay, how about
But I
this?
don't.
Is the police union's perspective on it an awakening? Because they have a strong perspective on it as well.
Not everything is an awakening.
So
Why
what
does everything
is?
have to be
What
either an
is?
awakening
I'm
or a
asking you
crisis?
what
Why
it
can't
is. You
it
are not.
determine
I am agreeing with you. Not everything is an awakening. Can you give me any single piece of input that would tell me
revolution?
how I know whether it's an awakening or not?
The consciousness revolution.
That's not it.
The
That's not an adjudicatory mechanism. Give me an adjudicatory mechanism so I
Great
know.
Awakening. What about the three great awakenings that happened in America?
Okay, I'm
There's
asking you this
literally
question.
periods of time called the Great Awakening.
Okay, listen to me, Beau. Listen, please, please listen to the words and see if you can answer them.
They literally have periods in time called the Great Awakening.
I'm looking for a test. Here is a situation, Eric. How can you know if it's an awakening? Why, you apply this criterion, Eric.
Moral challenges.
So every time someone faces moral challenges, it's an awakening?
Yes.
Every time?
Yes.
Now, if in fact I'm really feeling
Awakening-
guilty about
Awakening-
shoplifting, if I'm really feeling guilty about shoplifting, am I engaged in a societal awakening or personal awakening?
Your awakening does not need to be society's awakening.
Okay, so how do I know which part of society is awakening and which part of society is the bad guy?
There are no bad guys.
So everyone's awakening. Well, what if my police union's awakening is in direct contrast with your Black Lives Matter awakening?
That has nothing to do with it. Then they fight.
Okay, so what are you saying? Nothing.
That can lead to a crisis itself. Race wars can lead to a crisis.
Well, gosh, it sounds like to me it's just an awakening party. When did crisis come into this? Everything's an
Because
awakening,
when they're
remember?
fighting,
Oh, so when they're just yelling at each other, it's an awakening?
war is a crisis.
Okay, so was the execution of
War
5
is
Dallas
the
police officers a
failure of
crisis?
people to work out their
Was the
position.
execution of the Dallas police officers a crisis?
Huh?
Was the execution of the cops in Dallas a crisis?
You can say that was a moral crisis, sure, but I don't believe that's a actual societal crisis.
Okay, so
There
how
are
can you tell the
differences between
difference? How
war
can you
efforts
tell the difference?
because whether or not it's enforced by institutions.
I see. Okay, so if I'm working on behalf of an institution and I have strong beliefs, you already said the police union was engaged in an awakening. But now you're saying, in fact, if you're the police union, you're part of a crisis.
They
So
can
which
be
is it?
both. They're
Oh,
they're
both.
congealing once
They're
another. They're
both
congealing
concurrently.
into reforming
So,
themselves. They're
so Beau,
congealing
I will inform you one more
time.
time. You are not saying words that mean anything.
No, they can congeal at different times. Do you even see my diagram?
They could congeal at different times. So
Like there could be an awakening for
I
someone,
could
crisis
one day
for
be
someone else.
engaged in oppression on the part of the state that is part of a crisis. The next day, that crisis, because I am still engaged in the same behavior, somehow becomes an awakening. Because why?
That can be completely true.
Okay, so then what meaningful information have you given us?
That there are highs and lows that exist within moral attitudes.
For you personally or everyone?
Anyone contributing to society.
Across any particular time frame structure, or no longer are we going with that?
Any time frame structure, but the way in which it happens in Western societies is at a like planned rate. It's
Planned by whom?
It's by a seculum. It's by a season.
And so, is there actually somebody planning anything, or no? Or are you just
No,
using
it's
plan
about
metaphorically?
whether you follow the archetype or not.
So you're predicting that this vague description of a historical progression that withstands no definitional scrutiny, that you're not actually saying anything meaningful, that this
Oh my God!
progression.
You reject things because you don't understand them.
Beau, listen. To the extent that I do not understand anything here, it's because when I press on you, instead of explaining it, you squirrel away. It's
No,
true.
I tell you directly.
Beau, look, I'm being objective
I
here.
answered all your questions. I answered that well. I did a good job there.
You didn't. Okay? What I'm pointing out to you is number one, you don't even know the difference between a crisis and a awakening, and that's the core of your argument here. And yet you have no definition for either one, and in fact they can congeal and become the same thing at certain times, and it's totally mush.
It's not the same thing. Different things to different people.
Okay, so it's mush then. You're not saying anything.
It's not mush. It's
What's
what
your
it
point?
is being perceived.
You don't have a
It's
point.
what's being perceived.
You
It's
don't have
just
a
a
point.
perception. It's not even objective. It's not about whether it's objective or not. It's a perception of what we believe
What's
in
a
the social
perception? What's a perception?
social atmosphere.
Okay, you're not using language precisely at all. What's this thing?
What do you mean? It's just a perception.
What is a perception?
Something we view
No,
as
what are you referring to as just a perception?
the awakening in crisis. It's not objective.
Okay, so it's a metaphor, right?
Yes.
Okay, so then when you say you're using this metaphor to predict the future, basically, you're saying we're
Not
like
really to predict the future, but
Okay.
to organize it. Because there can be two crises at once. And we
don't
can
bother
skip that.
staking out positions if all you're going to do is scramble away from them until you're not actually said anything. If you're going to stake a position out, then defend that position. Thus far,
We're not doing it to predict the future.
Why then? What does this shit you're talking about mean?
We're not doing it to control people. We're doing it to choose
Doing
behavior.
what?
Our moral attitude.
We're doing our moral attitudes?
Or changing our moral attitude.
Okay, well, right now you're doing my moral attitude in the ass, and it doesn't really appreciate it. Because,
You want this to the end of the video?
because you aren't saying shit, dude. That's a simple God's
I
honest truth.
am.
No, you are spouting a lot of syllables that amount to absolutely fucking nothing. The end.
No,
Thanks for watching Talking with Spanish People. That's absolutely accurate truth.